Code Fun Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of CHAOSScast. This is the community podcast where we share use cases, experiences, and measuring open source community health, elevating conversations about metrics, analytics, and software from the Community Health Analytics open source software, for short, CHAOSS project, to where you like to listen. Welcome to this episode.
What do you think are some of the key strategies you've used over the years to propel your career in community management, community strategy?
It's a good question, Nicole. I think there's kind of two pieces to that in some ways. There's like, what are we doing to build great communities? And I think the thing that's been really fun about this is it's not often you get to, participate in a new and burgeoning thing. Like when I got involved in this, I'd never heard the term community manager before. I didn't even hear the term community manager until I went for my job at Canonical in 2006. So I think we've all been kind of figuring out how this works. What are the names for things? What is the terminology? What is the approach to metrics? What is the approach to gamification and to platforms and infrastructure and diversity and inclusion? All these different pieces. We've been kind of writing the recipe book as we've been going along. And I think that's been really fun. And to me, the only way in which you do anything great is by lots of people feeding into the process and making loads of mistakes. And so my goal has been, as I've experimented in my own world, to talk a lot about it, write a lot of blog posts and talk on videos and do other kinds of things to share that. Not as this is the perfect way of doing things, just to kind of add to the zeitgeist so people can kind of talk through it.
And there's this interesting dichotomy that I think you really rose in, of the fact that being a community manager wasn't necessarily a job title. It wasn't a thing that necessarily existed when you started,
Right.
But it did exist. There were online communities that came up back in early 2000s. And it's just kind of managing that dichotomy between, we have this role and I really want to do this. I think we can manage this success, but the role doesn't quite exist yet with those people that are actually building them.
I remember when I was, for example, younger, when I lived at home with my parents and I was interested in tech, but there's a magazine in the UK called Computer Weekly, and there'd be loads of jobs listed in there. And you'd always be talking about, you need a degree and you need to know enterprise this and enterprise that. And I felt quite excluded out of that because I didn't know anything about that world. I didn't know anyone who worked in that world. And what I loved about open source was there's an opportunity for lots of people to kind of come in and have a go. And I think having a go is what it's all about. What struck me back then was no one really knew how that worked. We just kind of showed up and it kind of happened. It was happening on Usenet and it was happening on mailing lists, but it just kind of happened. And I was interested in the science behind why that was happening. And what I found really fascinating was that back then, as much of it as is today, whenever anybody talked about community, it was talked about as this really sacred principle. Like the community is what makes us who we are. It's what makes us so strong. Which is when I started realizing the importance of data, because I had no idea. I thought gamification was cool and we could do something, but I had really no idea whether it would work. And that's when I started realizing I'm sitting on a pile of data. I've built this like kind of test framework for the system. Now I can actually not just look at the numbers, but look at what is the pattern between those numbers. And that's when I started thinking, okay, well, wow, data's really insightful, isn't it? And everybody else is like, yeah. Of course it is, you idiot. It's like, okay, welcome to the party, John.
Yeah. Speaking as someone who spends a lot of time in Google Data Studio, I have to say putting together that infrastructure and that framework, those years of taking those numbers and looking at, okay, is gamification really working, or is it just training people to receive rewards that may not help with the community? And so being able to elaborate on what those gamification factors are and take this notion of the numbers and the statistics telling a story and giving it to the community to tell a voice is really, really powerful. We had a conversation a few weeks ago about vanity metrics and what a vanity metric really is and when it's useful and when it's not useful. The way that I tend to build dashboards for these communities is you have a dashboard that tells you you're going 75 miles an hour on the road, slow down, speed up, or keep going, you're fine. And then there's a report where it's like, all right, pull the car off to the side of the road. Your engine is smoking. What happened? So a vanity metric on a dashboard might be very useful for community X, but terrible for community Y, and still useful in a report for community Z.
The way I tend to think about this is I don't think we'll ever be able to get completely clean data to ever come to a complete evaluation of that overall kind of community life cycle of someone's participation, because, you know, we're in the business of tangible and intangible value. You know, the pull request is great, but if you are a really mean-spirited, nasty person that writes great code, well, you're kind of detracting in the community. You're not just adding value. So it's really tough, I think. The conclusion that I've come to here is I'm a big fan of, I guess, what I would call kind of an aggregate evaluation of the value. And what I mean by that is, for example, you know, when I am talking about community, I'll often talk about this model that I developed over the years called the community participation lifecycle, which is basically, you know, casual members and then your regulars and then your core. And then to me, I think having milestones that are in your system to say you've graduated from a casual member to a regular member and then to a core member is really useful. And you may have like more kind of periods than just those three. I think that one of the things that I see as a recurring problem with businesses who see the value of community and they hire a community manager and they bring them in is I think that again, without wishing to sound like some horrible buzzwordy person, there's kind of like different types of value that are not connected together effectively. So, you know, whenever I've run the Community Leadership Summit every year, I'd hear the same thing in the pub every night with people who I've known for years or new friends that I meet there. And we're having the social event. We're all stood around eating little appetizers. And people often say, like, I've done all this work and the company doesn't get what I do. And I think part of the problem for that is I think community professionals really focus on the things that we know, right? Which is the data and blogging and awareness and social media and governance pieces and open source and all of these different elements. And I think a lot of community managers, when they go into an organization, they want to make sure that their skills are clear and that they've got the ability to move the needle in those areas and they generate great results. But then you'll get an executive who's not involved in this because it's just not their world. And then they look at this person who's receiving a lot of money for their salary. They're having to go to all these conferences, all of this swag, they see it as a cost center. And then they say, what are we getting out of this?
Yeah. And honestly, that's me. I've been in that position before. I've gone in and speaking as the anthropologist, I'm like, yeah, I'll build this community for you. Social science. This is going to be really great.
Right.
And then come the end of it all, we have an executive who's never heard of the scientific method being changed into the social scientific process. And I'm over here going, how do I speak to you? How do I prove this? And it just got me into trouble and it got me frustrated.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult as well because, you know, I think a lot of this is about translating information between different groups of people. I think the other thing there is it's understandable for a lot of organizations to think the community team should be in the marketing team because they see it as, well, this is all outreach, right? But what's interesting is most companies don't see customer success and marketing in the same team. And it's all outreach, right? I mean, sales is technically outreach. We just tend to get lumped in, I think, because I think it's largely a not particularly well understood thing. And often it's dealing with cold leads. But the impetus with marketing is usually around leads or brand, although I think unless you're a Coca-Cola, you don't tend to spend a lot of money on brand marketing. But with us, with community, of course, it is about, like you touched on, Nicole, it's about relationships and that's a long game. But I think the good news is, you know, the story is changing. I think businesses are starting to understand it. And I think, frankly, we can thank, you know, a lot of the social media for that as well. I think people are really realizing the value of like long form relationship building. I think we're going to start seeing communities becoming more and more of a priority inside of really large enterprises. You know, I mean, I've experienced this myself, like working with a bunch of banks where they don't necessarily just want to build open source communities, in some cases inner source, but what they really care about is unlocking the silos that people are locked in and getting people to collaborate together. And inner source is a great way of doing that. So I think understanding the dynamics of running a technology project inside the walls of a business, I think is going to be great. And, there's been lots of great work at the Inner Source Commons and elsewhere around this that I think is really fueling that. I also think that we're going to hopefully start seeing the business kind of language of community becoming clearer, where community reports into, what expectations should look like. And I think the reason why that's becoming better is because there's more examples now. I think most businesses are pretty reluctant to do significantly new things outside of their comfort zone. And setting up a community, I think, can be pretty nerve-wracking. I'm also really happy to just see the increased focus on diversity. And we talk a lot, I think, in our world, and as we rightly should do, about gender diversity, sexual diversity, political diversity. And I think that's really important. And that's a mission we need to continue on. But I'm also thrilled to see the diversity of communities, like people building art communities and people building documentation communities and all of that kind of stuff. Diversity in every form, to me, I think we need to encourage. And I think we'll have more examples of that. Like I was literally this morning talking to a guy who wants to set up a community for farmers who basically they can't sell their meat and they want to be able to donate the meat to kind of homeless shelters. And he was like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what a community is and how it works. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more of those things. I think the format that we've been building in the open source world is so applicable to many other places as well.
It's got me thinking about how people can move between, open source communities, because one of the things that you can't help but do is immediately draw comparisons of the new place that you're living to the old place that you've lived. And I think this might be a useful thought experiment for community managers to do around onboarding. Like when they have new people coming in there to community, you don't necessarily want to cater to every whim. It's like, well, in my old place, we used to do it like this. And, but maybe there are ways to find small and easy comfort points for new people coming into a community. And making them feel a little more welcome without necessarily making drastic changes to your own community.
I think that wraps up this episode. Thank you so much, Jono, for joining us, and to all of our viewers as well. If you want to stay up to date on future episodes, subscribe for free to this podcast on any favorite podcast app. We're actually on Apple, which is really wonderful. Share this podcast with your friends, your colleagues. We would definitely appreciate it if we're going to build that chaos method. And if you have ideas for future episodes, topics, or even would like to come on as a guest, please email us at podcast@chaos.community. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, this is your Chaos Community.